For 24 years, the Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham was dominated by a single figure, Judge Meredith Langford. Her name echoed through the halls in fearful whispers, always accompanied by stories of cases being twisted before they even began. She didn't need to raise her voice to command respect. Her cold stare and overwhelming authority did that for her. Younger lawyers learned quickly, challenging Langford was a mistake that could cost them dearly. Some lost cases they should never have lost. Others had their reputations destroyed without explanation. But no one had ever managed to prove anything against her. At least, not until that day. Darnell Hayes knew exactly where he was stepping when he entered the courtroom that morning. At 48, he carried not only experience, but also the weight of countless battles fought against a system that didn't play fair. He was no ordinary lawyer. His name appeared in high-profile cases, always defending those whom justice seemed to want to ignore. But this time, it wasn't just about a case. He had a plan. He wasn't just there to defend Tyrone Wills, a black man falsely accused of theft. He was there to expose everything, and if everything went as planned, this would be the last time Meredith Langford manipulated a trial. The courtroom was packed. Reporters sneaked through the public benches, alert for any detail that might indicate the direction of the trial. Tyrone Wills's case shouldn't have been a big deal. Just another criminal case where the prosecution's word carried more weight than any actual fact. But Darnell knew this case was different. Something had been wrong from the start. The absence of concrete evidence, the wavering testimony of the only prosecution witness, the speed with which the case had moved to trial. It all smelled like a setup, and at the center of it all was Langford, running the case with her usual coldness. But this time, she didn't realize she was being watched in a different way. Darnell wasn't an ordinary lawyer. He knew how to play the game. The judge entered the room without haste, her black robe pristine, her steps calculated. She sat on the bench as though it were a throne. Her gaze swept the room before landing on Darnell. He noticed how she scrutinized him, almost as if she were trying to predict his next moves. But what she didn't know was that over the years, he had studied her patterns. He knew exactly which buttons to push, and Langford, convinced she was untouchable, was about to do exactly what he wanted. The hearing began as any other under her command, with a suffocating aura of inevitability. The prosecution was given plenty of space to ask their questions, while every attempt by Darnell to challenge them was met with the same mechanical indifference. But little by little, he would start to push her into error. Darnell began with a subtle move. He asked the main prosecution witness to repeat his testimony, a simple request, but one with a purpose. The man, a convenience store clerk, had already given a report full of inconsistencies. If he stumbled again, it would be clear his word wasn't trustworthy. The prosecution tried to interrupt, claiming that it had already been established, but Darnell insisted, and as expected, Langford denied the request without hesitation. It was a predictable, authoritarian decision and, most importantly, wrong. Darnell mentally noted it, another mistake in the pile of abuses he was collecting. But he didn't back down. Instead, he changed his approach. He picked up a copy of the previous testimony and began reading excerpts aloud, forcing the witness to confirm each detail. And there, in front of everyone, the man began to falter. He hesitated, swapped words, confused the dates. The tension in the room grew. Prosecutor Calloway shifted uncomfortably. Langford noticed what was happening and intervened, cutting Darnell off mid-sentence. "That's already been established, Mr. Hayes. Move on to another question." But by that moment, the damage had already been done. Everyone saw it, even the jurors. The game was starting to turn, and Langford was helping without even realizing it. Darnell glanced briefly at the jurors. Some quickly looked away, as if afraid to show they were noticing the manipulation, but others couldn't hide the doubt growing on their faces. It was a sign that Langford wasn't maintaining absolute control, and that's exactly what he needed. He knew that if he pressed just a bit more, he could expose her even further. The next step came in a calculated manner. He requested to hear a new witness, a store employee who had been present on the day of the alleged crime, but whose testimony had conveniently been ignored by the prosecution. As expected, Langford rejected the request before the prosecutor could object. "This witness is irrelevant to the case," she declared, her voice firm but calm. It was a glaring mistake. A mistake Darnell needed. He took a deep breath, pretending to accept the decision, then leaned slightly over the table. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this witness can prove that Tyrone Wills wasn't even in the store at that time." The room fell silent. This was the kind of statement that couldn't be ignored. But Langford didn't blink. "You've made your assertion. The jury will consider only the evidence properly presented." Calloway tried to hide a smile at the corner of his mouth. He knew Langford would protect him no matter the truth, but Darnell simply added another point to his list. Each arbitrary decision of hers was another piece in the puzzle he was putting together. He needed Langford to go too far, and he knew, at the right moment, she would. The trial continued, and Langford kept dictating the pace of the courtroom with her usual coldness. Calloway, increasingly confident, began to rely more on the judge's authority than on his own case. This became evident when he introduced a piece of evidence that had never been presented during the discovery phase, a supposed receipt linking Tyrone Wills to the crime. Darnell didn't need to feign his indignation. He stood up immediately. "Objection! This document was not included in the discovery phase. The defense never had access to it." He knew this was a direct violation of the law established by the Brady v. Maryland case, which required the prosecution to disclose all evidence, especially evidence potentially favorable to the defense. Any impartial judge would recognize this as grounds for an immediate continuance or even dismissal. But Langford didn't hesitate. "Denied. The document is admissible." The murmur that ran through the room was impossible to contain. Even the reporters exchanged surprised looks. Calloway looked at the judge, surprised at how quickly she made her decision. He probably expected some resistance before being allowed to use the evidence, but Langford wasn't concerned with subtleties. She was so used to acting without consequences that she didn't realize she was digging her own grave. Darnell made sure to wait a moment before speaking. He let the discomfort spread through the room. Then, with a firm voice, he repeated the objection, ensuring it was recorded again in the records. He needed that documented. And when Langford rejected it once again, just as he knew she would, the noose would tighten even further. Langford adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Darnell, impassive. "The decision stands. The document will be accepted as evidence." Her voice was calm, devoid of any emotion, as if dealing with something trivial. But at that moment, she had made the mistake Darnell had been waiting for. He didn't argue further. He simply nodded slightly, sat down, and grabbed his pen, jotting something down in his notebook. The tension in the room became palpable. The jurors looked uneasy, sensing something was very wrong. Calloway, now more confident, began to speak about how the receipt was the definitive proof of Tyrone Wills' guilt. But Darnell wasn't even listening. His mind was already several steps ahead. He waited for Calloway to finish, maintained his composure, and then did something unexpected. He took out his own phone and, under the judge's watchful eye, opened an email. Then, without haste, he stood up again. "Your Honor, I request that this court accept a newly obtained piece of evidence from the defense." Langford furrowed her brow, impatient. "You had time to present your evidence, Mr. Hayes. The trial will proceed." But Darnell didn't relent. He turned the phone so everyone could see the screen. "This is an official response from the store manager confirming that no receipt was issued in my client's name that day." The reaction was immediate. The murmur grew, and Calloway looked visibly uncomfortable. The trap was set. Langford could insist on favoring the prosecution, but now any decision she made would only make her bias more evident. Langford leaned slightly forward, as if evaluating her next words carefully. But everyone in the room already knew what was about to happen. With a calm, indifferent voice, she declared, "This alleged evidence was not submitted in advance. It will not be admitted." Darnell wasn't surprised, nor did he protest. On the contrary, it was exactly what he had expected to hear. The weight of that decision spread through the room, provoking incredulous looks among the jurors and journalists present. The impartiality that should have been the hallmark of any judge had vanished before everyone's eyes. Calloway tried to hide his relief, but his gaze betrayed him. He knew that without the judge's protection, his case was hanging by a thread. Langford, however, seemed unconcerned with the situation she had created. After all, this was how she had always run her courtroom. Darnell didn't flinch at the denial. It was exactly what he had hoped for. With surgical patience, he continued collecting the evidence of the judge's bias, aware that with every denial, every injustice, she was digging her own grave. The morning dragged on slowly as the prosecution continued with its weak argument, sustained more by Langford's decisions than by solid facts. Tyrone, sitting next to Darnell, quietly clenched his hands, struggling against his nervousness. Each passing minute seemed to reduce his chances of freedom. But Darnell stayed focused. He knew that this theater had a deadline, and the end was closer than anyone imagined. Darnell realized the crucial moment to intensify his plan had arrived. Until then, he had carefully provoked small demonstrations of Langford's bias. Now, he needed something more decisive, something impossible to ignore or minimize. He knew that doing so was risky. His career, maybe even his reputation, was on the line. After all, Meredith Langford wasn't someone who could be provoked lightly. However, he had made his decision long before that morning. No matter the personal cost, he would no longer allow injustice to prevail in that court. As the prosecution continued with its superficial questions and false confidence, Darnell mentally reviewed the plan one last time. He just had to wait for the exact moment to act. Meanwhile, in the jury box, a middle-aged woman, a retired teacher, began showing clear signs of discomfort. Darnell had noticed the change in her behavior. At first, she seemed to trust the judicial system completely. Now, her eyes reflected deep doubts. She furrowed her brow every time the judge interrupted Darnell, and it was evident she recognized the irregularities in the trial. Other jurors, equally uncomfortable, exchanged discreet glances, silently seeking confirmation of their impressions. Something that morning had become clear even to the most naive. The courtroom controlled by Langford was not fair. Tyrone's case was revealing much more than just one man's guilt or innocence. It was revealing how easily justice could be distorted by those in power. As the morning wore on, the courtroom seemed to grow smaller, consumed by a discomfort that increased among everyone present. Darnell remained calm on the outside, although inside he was struggling to control the unease. He knew the next step needed to be taken precisely. His strategy relied on pushing Langford to the limit, but not so quickly that it would seem intentional. He needed her to reveal just how abusive her power had become. That's why he remained silent for a few minutes, letting Prosecutor Calloway believe he had won that round. However, every time Langford denied a fair request, the silent revolt among the audience grew. Journalists took frantic notes, realizing that this hearing was no ordinary court session. Something big was about to happen, and no one wanted to miss it. Finally, lunchtime arrived. Darnell stayed seated for a few seconds after the recess announcement, watching Langford leave the room with the same arrogant calm she always carried, showing no signs of discomfort or regret. Tyrone sighed deeply beside him, weary, exhausted by the injustice, but unable to express his frustration in words. Darnell placed a firm hand on his shoulder, trying to reassure him. The lawyer knew it wasn't easy to be in his client's shoes, especially when everything had seemed lost from the start. But Darnell also knew the game wasn't over yet. In fact, the most important move was still to come. After a brief break, the court reconvened. That's when Darnell decided to make an unexpected move, something that would catch Langford completely off guard. He stood up slowly, took a deep breath, and announced firmly, "I formally request the presence of the supervisor of the police forensic team, as we have grounds to question the legitimacy of the evidence presented by the prosecution." Calloway immediately reacted with surprise, almost stumbling over his words as he vehemently objected, arguing that it was unnecessary. Langford made a short, impatient gesture, as if she had already made her decision before hearing the full request. "Denied," she said, with the same indifference she had shown so many times before. Darnell let the silence fill the room, staring at the judge, not blinking, not looking away. Her calmness disturbed him deeply, but he needed her to remain confident so that she would make even bigger mistakes. And Langford was growing more and more secure in her position, unaware that every denial only reinforced the conviction among the audience that this trial was far from fair. The stage was set for something that even the judge couldn't foresee. Darnell waited patiently for Prosecutor Calloway to finish his final presentation. He watched closely as the young assistant prosecutor struggled to maintain a confident appearance, but it was clear how much he depended on the decisions already made by Judge Langford. The lawyer knew the crucial moment had arrived, the turning point he had been working tirelessly for. The audience was uneasy, sensing that something was about to happen, even though they didn't know exactly what. Some looks subtly turned toward Darnell, seeking any signal of what might come next. The lawyer's serene posture contrasted with the tension evident in the others. The courtroom was ready, now more than ever, for something extraordinary. When Calloway sat down, with a discreet sigh of relief, Langford turned her cold, impassive gaze toward Darnell. "Defense, your next step?" she asked in her usual calm, monotonous voice, as if she were merely fulfilling a tedious formality. Darnell stood up calmly, adjusting his tie discreetly before speaking. "Your Honor, considering the evidence presented and, especially, the improper introduction of evidence by the prosecution, I formally request that this court declare a mistrial due to a direct violation of my client's constitutional rights." There was a brief moment of absolute silence. The whole room seemed to hold its breath, anticipating an immediate reaction from the judge. Langford leaned slightly forward, her sharp eyes fixed on Darnell. It was clear she hadn't expected such boldness. However, instead of showing insecurity, her expression hardened even more, ready to reject the request immediately. But before she could say a word, something happened, something that would change the dynamic of the room forever. Before Langford could proceed with her usual cold rejection, the double doors at the back of the room opened with force. Two federal agents with stern expressions and determined steps walked down the center aisle toward the judge's bench. The sudden interruption caused a wave of murmurs in the courtroom. Heads turned as Langford, who rarely showed surprise, raised her eyebrows in slight irritation. Still, she tried to maintain her usual control. In a firm voice, but with a slight trace of impatience, she tried to interrupt. "This court is in session. I request that you wait outside until we finish." But the agents didn't slow down. Their determination made it clear that they were not there to follow orders. The first agent stopped in front of the bench and distinctly raised his badge, looking directly at Langford. "Judge Meredith Langford, we need to speak with you immediately." His voice was controlled but assertive, making it clear this was not a polite request, but an official order. Langford stood still for a moment, trying to assess the gravity of the situation, and for perhaps the first time in her long career, she felt threatened. Her expression of discomfort was brief, but enough to be noticed by everyone. She took a deep breath, adjusted herself in the chair, and responded with the forced calm of someone who believed she still had control. "Whatever the matter is, it will have to wait. I will not interrupt this trial for any reason." The second agent, even firmer and more decisive, took a step forward. His voice rang out loud and clear, echoing off the walls of the room, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "This is not a request, Judge Langford. It is an order. This is a matter of federal interest, and it cannot wait." At that moment, a silence so thick it could be felt settled over the room. Even Calloway, who had been protected by the judge's absolute authority, seemed in shock, unable to believe what he was seeing. Langford stood still for a few seconds, as if trying to absorb the full magnitude of the unexpected interruption in her territory. For the first time in decades, her absolute dominance seemed seriously threatened. She slowly stood with rigid dignity, trying to maintain her usual authority. "Gentlemen," she began in a dry, controlled tone, "this is not how you interrupt a court. You must leave immediately." But before she could finish the sentence, the second agent stepped forward and clearly announced, without raising his voice, "We have a warrant for your arrest." The phrase landed like a bomb in the room. Journalists, jurors, and spectators began murmuring, many in evident shock. Langford's eyes briefly widened before she regained her calm mask, though it took visible effort. This was the exact moment Darnell had been waiting for. He felt his heart race, but he didn't allow his expression to show satisfaction. His meticulously planned strategy had finally reached its goal. As the judge hesitated momentarily, the second agent moved closer and, removing a document from his suit pocket, clearly announced, "Meredith Langford, we have a federal arrest warrant against you for charges of corruption, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violations of civil rights under United States federal laws." Langford seemed to stagger briefly before subtly leaning against the bench. The room exploded into contained chaos, a mix of surprise, satisfaction, and relief dominating the audience. Darnell stood still, feeling a powerful mix of satisfaction and responsibility. This wasn't just about bringing down a corrupt judge. It was about showing the entire system that no one was above the law. Calloway was stunned, unable to react. His arrogance had completely evaporated in the face of the unfolding scene. Darnell took a deep breath, keeping any triumphant expression under control. This wasn't a moment of celebration. It was a moment of confirmation, revelation, a necessary break that he had patiently waited for from the beginning of the trial. The two federal agents moved toward the judge, flanking the bench with mechanical precision. Langford stared blankly into space, trying to process the magnitude of the situation. Her mind scrambled to find an escape from this public humiliation, but there was no alternative. She, who had been so accustomed to controlling every detail in her courtroom, now watched helplessly as her reputation crumbled before everyone. The federal agents weren't intimidated like the lawyers she silenced every day. To them, Langford wasn't a figure of authority. She was just another accused person. The judge shot one final, icy look at Darnell, as if trying to capture any reaction from him, perhaps seeking hatred or satisfaction. But all she found was a firm, impassive gaze, almost indifferent, as if he were merely watching an inevitable consequence of justice finally being served. With swift, silent movements, the agents encircled the bench. One of them discreetly but firmly took a pair of handcuffs from his pocket. Langford flinched imperceptibly. The thought of being handcuffed in front of the people she had judged, condemned, and ignored for decades seemed unbearable. She opened her mouth, about to argue or protest, but her voice faltered before she could make a sound. It was too late to use her power as a shield. The agent fastened the cuffs around her wrists, and the metallic click echoed subtly, but loudly enough to reach every corner of the room. The moment seemed to paralyze everyone in the courtroom. Calloway looked on the verge of desperation. He knew that this arrest meant more than Langford's downfall. It also marked the end of his own easy path, where decisions were always made in his favor. The jurors watched in stunned silence, many still unable to believe what they were witnessing. The fall of the most powerful judge in the region, a woman who, just minutes before, had seemed untouchable and unshakable. Langford was led slowly around the bench, accompanied by the agents, her face impassive, but her pride clearly shattered. She didn't raise her eyes once as she walked, as if avoiding the stares that were surely upon her. Looks filled with astonishment, satisfaction, or even pity. As she passed by Tyrone Wills in the central aisle, he watched it all, unable to believe his eyes. His expression was a mix of astonishment, relief, and a deep sense of justice finally achieved. Tyrone had spent years being a victim of that system. Now he was seeing something he never imagined possible. Langford was experiencing the helplessness she had imposed on him and so many others. Darnell watched his client's silent reaction with deep empathy, aware of the significance of that moment for Tyrone and many like him. This wasn't just the fall of a corrupt judge. It was a historic response to decades of injustices that had accumulated in that courtroom. When the judge finally reached the central aisle, near the benches where spectators watched in awe, she lifted her head for a brief moment and stared directly into Darnell's eyes. Her voice came out as a tense whisper, heavy with resentment and bitterness. "You planned all this." It wasn't a question, but a statement. Darnell didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't show any sign of personal victory. He simply responded in a low, firm voice, filled with the calm of someone who had always known what they were doing. "No, Meredith, you did this yourself." And then he turned his gaze away, letting her pass. The court door slowly opened in front of her, the same door she had crossed thousands of times with arrogance and impunity. This time, however, Meredith Langford was leaving the courtroom not as a judge, but as a defendant. When the heavy doors of the courthouse closed behind Meredith Langford, an unsettling silence took over the room. The audience seemed to still be processing what they had just witnessed, while journalists frantically sent messages on their phones, realizing they had just witnessed something historic. The most powerful judge in the region, who for decades had used her position to control the fates of those who entered her courtroom, had just fallen before the incredulous eyes of everyone. Calloway, the young prosecutor, stared fixedly at the floor, his expression now one of pure embarrassment. It was clear to everyone that his imminent victory had been built on an unjust foundation. The confidence he had entered that morning with had evaporated, replaced by shame and uncertainty about his own future. Langford's authoritarian and silent presence had disappeared, leaving behind a vast void that no one seemed to know how to fill. It was as if everyone was waiting for new guidance, but no one knew exactly what to do. Darnell realized he needed to act quickly. Seizing the silence and confusion, he stood calmly, adjusting his tie with a casual gesture, though his heart beat fast. His voice echoed through the room, firm and clear, breaking the heavy atmosphere. "Your Honor," he addressed the court clerk, now visibly stunned. "In light of the recent circumstances and the clear evidence of misconduct by Judge Langford, I request an immediate suspension of the trial and the immediate release of my client, Tyrone Wills." The jurors, who had remained silent until then, began murmuring among themselves, silently agreeing with the request. It was evident to all of them that the process had completely lost its legitimacy. Calloway didn't make any objection. There was no room left for that. The clerk hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to proceed, until he finally nodded, signaling that he would forward the request to the higher court. Minutes later, the side door of the room opened again. This time, the judge who would temporarily take over the session entered. Judge Edward Collins, a veteran known for his impartiality and integrity. With a calm stride and a serious face, he took the seat Langford had just vacated. After a brief moment of silence, he carefully studied the faces in the courtroom. His serious expression indicated full awareness of the significance of the moment. Finally, with a calm voice full of moral authority, he announced, "Considering the exceptional circumstances and the recent arrest of the judge responsible for this case, this court hereby officially declares the trial against Mr. Tyrone Wills concluded. All charges are immediately dismissed due to lack of valid evidence and the clear contamination of the process by judicial misconduct." The impact of those words sparked an immediate buzz, mixing relief and genuine surprise. Tyrone lowered his head, overcome with emotion, as silent tears streamed down his face. The justice he had never believed in finally made its presence known. Hearing the announcement from the substitute judge, Tyrone Wills sat motionless for a few seconds. Unable to fully believe what was happening, his eyes, used to expecting the worst, showed understandable caution, but gradually the truth of the moment began to settle in. For the first time since the beginning of this judicial nightmare, he felt the weight of the false accusations vanish. The man who had entered the courtroom with tense shoulders and a resigned look now felt an unfamiliar lightness fill him. By his side, Darnell watched him with silent pride. It was for moments like this that he had chosen his profession. He knew he couldn't undo the lost years or the suffering caused, but in that instant, he felt he had reclaimed something incredibly valuable: his client's dignity. Slowly, Tyrone rose from his seat, still uncertain, and hugged Darnell in an emotional gesture, ignoring the formal protocol of the courtroom. It was a brief hug, but full of meaning, a silent expression of gratitude and relief. In the audience, journalists recorded every moment of that scene with absolute attention. They knew this was the kind of story that would change careers, that would redefine reputations. Some began immediately sending messages or writing preliminary headlines, aware of the magnitude of the event. Ordinary people watching the trial exchanged emotional glances, many understanding for the first time how thin the line between justice and injustice could be. Even some courthouse staff, accustomed to Langford's daily authoritarianism, let subtle signs of relief show on their faces. Calloway, sitting almost motionless, stared at his papers scattered across the table, aware that he had participated, even indirectly, in this blatant injustice. For the first time, the young prosecutor seemed to understand the real weight of his actions. Meanwhile, Darnell showed no triumphant expression. His face remained firm and serious, aware that this was only a step in the long journey against a system that still needed to be deeply reformed. That victory was significant, yes, but it was just a beginning. As the handcuffs were slowly removed from Tyrone's wrists, a palpable sense of relief and justice filled the room. His wrists were marked by the pressure of the cuffs, symbols of the countless injustices he had suffered since the beginning of this process. He slowly raised his hands, looking at them with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Those same hands, which just hours ago symbolized false guilt, now represented reclaimed freedom. His breath quickened, overwhelmed by a deep and genuine emotion. Tyrone turned his eyes toward the jurors, sensing a similar feeling of relief in them. Some even seemed embarrassed, perhaps questioning how they could have allowed the judge's bias to almost lead them to commit a terrible injustice. It wasn't just Tyrone who had escaped that trap. The whole courtroom had awakened to the reality of the corruption that had permeated that place for decades. Darnell, maintaining his always professional demeanor, calmly placed his documents in his worn leather folder, the one that had seen many years of legal battles. As he did so, he noticed the respectful and admiring looks from the fellow lawyers in the audience. Many of them had suffered humiliating defeats at Langford's hands, having solid cases destroyed by her bias. Now, they saw in Darnell something more than just a competent lawyer. They saw someone capable of taking on a corrupt system and winning. Some exchanged knowing glances with him, silently acknowledging the significance of that victory, not just for Tyrone, but for everyone who had ever been unjustly treated in that room. Calloway, still seated, seemed unable to move, as if paralyzed by guilt. The prosecutor finally seemed to understand the real cost of his ambition. Perhaps, from that moment on, he would re-evaluate his professional choices. Perhaps not. But for Darnell, it didn't matter. His mission had been fulfilled, at least for that day. When he finally left the courtroom, accompanied by Tyrone, Darnell was surrounded by journalists, eagerly awaiting his first words. He stopped in front of them, calm, waiting patiently for the cameras to be adjusted. Although facing the press after complex trials was common for him, this time he knew it wasn't just another case. The arrest of a judge, especially one as powerful as Meredith Langford, was no trivial matter. Reporters shot questions at him all at once, mixing inquiries about his strategy, the impact of the arrest on the community, and even his own career. Darnell raised one hand, asking for calm, and waited until silence prevailed. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear, firm, and without exaggerated emotion. Today, justice was done, but we must not forget that this is only the beginning of a long journey. What happened today in this room must serve as a warning to all of us. No one, absolutely no one, is above the law. The journalists jotted down his words, knowing that statement represented something far deeper than a simple trial closing. After giving his statement to the press, Darnell calmly exited through the main entrance of the courthouse, now completely surrounded by a crowd of curious onlookers and journalists trying to capture every move he made. Ordinary people who had quickly learned what had happened began to gather, discussing with excitement what it meant for the city and the judicial system as a whole. Among them were relatives and friends of people who had unjustly passed through that courtroom, victims of the same bias now exposed for all to see. Many tried to approach Darnell, wanting to congratulate him, express gratitude, or simply see him up close. It was as if, in that moment, he had become a symbol of justice finally achieved, an unwavering defender against a system that, for decades, had seemed impenetrable. But he wasn't there for personal recognition. His gaze, always focused, revealed the awareness that this victory was only the first step in a much harder journey ahead. The fight against injustice had not ended there. On the contrary, it had only just begun. When he finally reached the courthouse parking lot, away from the crowd, Darnell allowed himself to take a deep breath, feeling the weight of that morning settle on his shoulders for the first time. He opened the door to his old black car and sat slowly in the driver's seat, placing the folder on the passenger seat. In the silence of that brief pause, he reflected on everything that had happened: the trial, the judge's arrest, Tyrone's emotional look as he regained his freedom. The significance of that victory was not small, and he was fully aware of it. But something inside him told him that this was just a small part of something larger, a necessary change, and much broader. He had faced many difficult trials throughout his career, but this one had been special in a completely different way. For the first time in a long time, he felt that his work had not only made a difference for one client, but had deeply affected the structure of the system itself. With the thought far away, he remembered how many people had given up, frustrated by the blatant injustice they witnessed in that courtroom. This gave him a renewed certainty that every fight was worth it, that every case deserved his full dedication, no matter how impossible it seemed. As Darnell reflected silently in the car, the image of Meredith Langford's defeated face kept returning to his mind. It wasn't a feeling of triumph he had, but something more complex and profound. He knew Langford represented much more than just a corrupt judge who had finally been unmasked. She was the symbol of an entrenched system, of a silent injustice that had long oppressed innocent people, especially black and poor people, without ever being effectively confronted. What happened in that courtroom wouldn't solve centuries of prejudice and structural inequality, but it was certainly a crucial step in the right direction. No matter how intense the emotion of that moment was, Darnell understood that he was facing a long battle, and the real challenge was turning that singular victory into real change in the daily lives of so many others facing similar injustices. With this reflection echoing in his mind, he started the car and drove off slowly, determined to continue the fight. Hours later, in the comfort of his simple office located in downtown Birmingham, Darnell sat at his desk, surrounded by piles of documents that told stories similar to the one he had just lived. Each folder held personal dramas, names, and faces of men and women whose lives had been turned upside down by unjust judgments conducted with prejudice or neglect. He stared at those folders for a few minutes in silence, recognizing that behind each case was a life waiting for justice, a justice that, until then, had seemed too distant to reach. He took a deep breath, feeling both exhausted and reinvigorated by the responsibility he carried. He knew many more battles would be fought in that same room, and new adversaries would arise, perhaps even more powerful and dangerous than Meredith Langford. However, Darnell now had a renewed certainty that he wasn't alone. The public's reaction, the courage of the jurors, and even the sudden awareness of prosecutors like Calloway showed there was hope. It might not be quick or easy, but there was finally a real possibility for change. That night, after a day that seemed endless, Darnell returned to his apartment in a quiet part of Birmingham. Upon entering, the usual silence of the place felt deeper than ever. On the table lay piles of documents, marked legal books, and meticulously organized files. His apartment was a perfect reflection of his life. Simple, focused, and organized, clearly showing a man dedicated to work above all else. Darnell sat in his favorite chair, allowing the exhaustion to finally take over. As he closed his eyes for a moment, the scenes from the courtroom returned with full force. He couldn't help but think about the impact that day would have on the entire community, especially those who had lived in the shadow of the injustices committed by Langford and others like her. He knew the road ahead would be difficult and exhausting, but he was determined to continue. That victory, despite its significance, was just a battle won in a much larger war. In his mind, the last words of Tyrone echoed when they parted ways at the courthouse exit. "People like her never pay for what they do." The phrase, heavy with emotion, expressed the feeling that dominated thousands of people, silent victims of a system that seemed to have been built against them. Darnell knew that this perception was rooted in history, in the collective memory of a people who had been betrayed so many times that they simply stopped believing in justice. But that victory was concrete proof that change was possible. For the first time in years, a powerful authority had been held accountable, exposed, and punished before everyone's eyes. It wouldn't heal all the wounds of the past, but it could begin to heal some of them. Still sitting, Darnell allowed himself to feel real relief for the first time that day. Despite the exhaustion, he felt rejuvenated by the certainty that he had done exactly what he set out to do when he started his career. Defend those who couldn't defend themselves, fight for those who had already lost hope. As he got up, he felt the weight of the hours worked and the tension accumulating in his shoulders finally start to lessen. He walked to the window, looking out at the quiet city beyond, its distant lights, and the night advancing slowly. As he reflected on everything that had happened, he clearly realized that this victory, while significant, shouldn't be seen as the end of the fight, but rather as the first step toward a larger transformation. That day had proven that no one was truly untouchable. Not even powerful judges like Meredith Langford could continue to operate above the law forever. This brought a new responsibility that he knew he would have to carry from that moment on. The next morning, his phone would undoubtedly be ringing non-stop with new cases, new challenges, people seeking justice. Darnell was ready for it. After all, he knew that his journey had never been easy, and it never would be. But he was willing to continue walking, fighting, defending, always with the renewed conviction that no matter how difficult, this was the only battle truly worth fighting. The next day dawned differently in Birmingham. On the streets, in cafes and offices, the dominant topic was the arrest of Judge Meredith Langford. In bold headlines, the words "corruption" and "justice" appeared side by side for the first time in many years, symbolizing a change that many had thought impossible. The entire city discussed the event with enthusiasm and surprise. For many, especially those who had directly faced injustice, there was a new and hopeful feeling in the air. People who had spent decades living with a constant sense of powerlessness now felt emboldened to believe in justice again. Social groups began to gather, discussing practical ways to use this moment to push for real changes in the local judicial system. Although everyone knew the battle hadn't ended there, for the first time in years, it felt like victory was possible, even against the most powerful opponents. And Darnell, though not present at any of these meetings, was constantly cited as an example of someone who had proven that it was possible to take on giants, as long as there was strategy, courage, and resilience. Meanwhile, that morning, Darnell arrived early at his office, determined to immediately resume his work. As he entered, he found an even larger pile of requests, letters, and emails from people across the country seeking help or offering support. Some letters told stories similar to Tyrone's, while others brought simple words of gratitude for the courage shown in that courtroom. Sitting alone at his desk, Darnell flipped through each message attentively, feeling a different weight now, not the weight of responsibility, which he had always carried, but the weight of genuine recognition for his quiet and constant efforts on behalf of the most vulnerable. Though his name was now linked to a historic victory, Darnell knew that his real mission was far from over. After all, there were still countless Tyrone wills across the country waiting for someone to fight for them. He also knew that his life had changed forever after that trial, not because he had gained fame or recognition, but because he had deeply felt the significance of his own mission. More than ever, he understood that justice wasn't just an abstract concept or a distant ideal. It was a daily, arduous, and tireless struggle, requiring the courage to confront power where it corrupted itself. Sitting at his desk, surrounded by documents representing countless lives, Darnell finally felt the absolute certainty that he had made the right choice when he entered that courtroom. And with unshakable calm, he opened the first folder of the morning, ready to face whatever came next. After all, this was not just his profession, but his reason for existence.